The shadow of stagnation. Do you ever feel like you're walking in circles while everyone else moves forward? There's a man I once knew who worked the same job for 15 years. Same desk, same tasks, same conversations. He told himself he was content, that stability meant success. But one morning, he looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, someone who had become invisible to the world and, more terrifyingly, to himself. This is what psychologists call learned helplessness, a condition first studied by Martin Seligman in 1972. When we stop trying to change our circumstances, even when we have the power to do so, we become prisoners of our own making. The mind, like a muscle left unused, begins to atrophy. Stagnation isn't just about career or money. It's about the slow death of curiosity. When we stop asking questions, stop seeking new experiences, stop challenging our own thoughts, we begin to fade. The Stoics understood this well. They knew that comfort, while seductive, is often the enemy of growth. Think of your mind as a river. When water stops flowing, it becomes stagnant, breeding decay. But when it moves, even slowly, it stays clean and vital. Your thoughts, your learning, your very essence needs this movement to remain alive. The shadow of stagnation creeps in quietly. First, you skip reading that book. Then you avoid that challenging conversation. Soon you're watching the same shows, thinking the same thoughts, living the same day over and over. You become a ghost haunting your own life. But here's what most people don't realize. Stagnation is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. Every morning, you choose between comfort and growth, between the familiar path and the uncertain one that might lead somewhere new. The man I mentioned earlier, he eventually left that job, not because he had to, but because he finally understood that staying safe was the most dangerous thing he could do. Sometimes the greatest risk is taking no risk at all. So I ask you again, are you moving forward or are you just marking time? The untrained mind. When did you last feel truly sharp, like your mind could cut through any problem? I remember watching my grandfather in his final years. He was a brilliant engineer who once designed bridges, but by 80, he struggled to remember my name. His family blamed age, but I wondered if something else was at play. Had he simply stopped using the very tool that once made him extraordinary? Neuroscientist Michael Merzenich discovered something remarkable in his 2013 studies on brain plasticity. The brain doesn't just age, it adapts to how we use it. If we feed it routine and comfort, it becomes lazy. If we challenge it daily, it grows stronger, even in old age. This phenomenon, called neuroplasticity, proves that mental decline isn't inevitable. It's often a choice. Most people treat their minds like old furniture, something that just sits there, gathering dust. They consume the same information, follow the same patterns, think the same thoughts they had 5 years ago. Then they wonder why they feel mentally sluggish, why new ideas seem foreign, why they can't keep up with a changing world. The Stoics knew this truth long before science proved it. They practiced daily mental exercises, not because they had to, but because they understood that an untrained mind becomes a prison. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not for others, but to keep his own thinking sharp. Think of two people at 40. One reads challenging books, learns new skills, questions their beliefs. The other watches television, scrolls social media, avoids anything that makes them uncomfortable. After 10 years, they're not just different people. They're operating with entirely different mental capacities. The tragedy isn't that we lose our sharpness with age. It's that we surrender it voluntarily. We choose easy over difficult, familiar over foreign, comfortable over challenging. Each choice seems small, but together they determine whether our minds grow or shrink. My grandfather's story had an unexpected turn. At 75, he started learning piano. His memory improved, his conversations became deeper, his eyes regained their spark. He proved that it's never too late to wake up a sleeping mind. The question isn't whether you can improve your thinking. The question is whether you will choose to do the work required. The architecture of freedom. When did you last feel truly free, not just from obligations, but from the need to depend on others for your survival. There's a man I knew who worked 40 years in the same factory. Every morning, same routine. Every paycheck, same amount. He thought he had security. Then one day, machines replaced his department. At 62, he discovered his security was actually a sophisticated form of slavery. He had traded 4 decades of potential growth for the illusion of safety. Jung wrote about psychological freedom, but there's something deeper here. True freedom isn't just mental, it's structural. The person who understands how systems work can navigate any system. The person who only knows how to follow rules becomes a prisoner when the rules change. Most people confuse working hard with working smart. They believe that if they just put in enough hours, someone will reward them with freedom. But here's what the Stoics understood. External circumstances will always be beyond your control. The only sustainable freedom comes from developing capabilities that make you independent of any single system. I've studied the patterns of those who achieve genuine autonomy. They don't just accumulate money, they accumulate understanding. They learn how money works, not just how to earn it. They study human psychology, not just their own field. They understand power structures, not just their position within them. Knowledge becomes their insurance policy against an unpredictable world. The shadow side of modern education is that it trains you to be a good employee, not a free person. You learn to follow instructions, meet deadlines, seek approval. But the skills that make you valuable to an employer often make you dependent on employment. Real education teaches you to create value independently. Jung observed that most people live in what he called collective conformity, unconsciously adopting the goals and values of their environment. They want what they're told to want, fear what they're told to fear. But financial freedom starts with psychological freedom, the ability to think independently about what you actually need. Here's the uncomfortable truth about freedom. It requires you to become comfortable with uncertainty. The person with one skill lives in constant fear of obsolescence. The person with multiple capabilities can adapt to any change. The person who understands principles can learn any application. The research on entrepreneurial psychology shows that successful business builders don't just work harder, they think differently. They see problems as opportunities. They view uncertainty as competitive advantage. They've trained their minds to find value where others see only chaos. Freedom isn't given, it's built. One skill, one insight, one capability at a time. The archaeology of excuses. What story do you tell yourself about why your life isn't where you wanted it to be? I once worked with a woman who had a remarkable talent for explaining her failures. Every missed opportunity had a perfect reason. Every abandoned project had compelling justification. She could construct elaborate narratives about circumstances, timing, and other people's actions. What she couldn't do was take responsibility for her choices. Jung called this psychological projection, the unconscious tendency to attribute our internal conflicts to external causes. But there's something more sinister happening here. Every excuse you craft becomes a brick in the prison you're building around your potential. The mind, seeking consistency, will find evidence to support whatever story you tell it. The Stoics understood this deeply. Epictetus, himself a former slave, taught that we suffer not from events, but from our judgments about events. The person who blames circumstances gives those circumstances power over their life. The person who owns their response maintains their agency. Here's what modern psychology reveals about excuse-making. Research by psychologist Albert Bandura shows that people who consistently externalize blame develop what he termed learned helplessness. Your excuses literally rewire your brain to feel powerless. Each time you say, "I can't because," you strengthen neural pathways that reinforce limitation. I've observed a pattern in those who remain stuck. They become archaeologists of their own failure, digging deeper into past events to explain present circumstances. Childhood trauma, economic disadvantage, lack of opportunities. These factors may explain how you got here, but they don't determine where you go next. The shadow of excuse-making is that it feels rational, even noble. You're not lazy, you're realistic. You're not afraid, you're being practical. But underneath every elaborate excuse is a simple truth you're avoiding. You haven't done what you know you should do. Jung discovered that our unconscious mind often sabotages what our conscious mind claims to want. We say we want success while unconsciously choosing behaviors that ensure failure. The excuse becomes a perfect alibi for this internal contradiction. I tried, but circumstances prevented me. Here's the brutal reality about excuses. They're always true and always irrelevant. Yes, you faced obstacles. Yes, others had advantages you didn't. Yes, timing wasn't perfect. But successful people faced similar challenges and found ways through them. The difference isn't in circumstances, it's in response. The most liberating psychological discovery is this: you are not your past. Every moment offers a choice to continue old patterns or create new ones. But that choice requires abandoning the comfortable identity of victim and accepting the uncomfortable responsibility of author. Your excuses are fossils of old defeats. Stop digging them up and start building something new. The eternal echo. What part of you will remain when everything else has turned to dust? Jung spent his final years contemplating what he called the transcendent function, the bridge between our mortal existence and something that outlasts physical death. Not in a religious sense, but in understanding how certain aspects of human experience echo across generations. The knowledge we cultivate, the wisdom we embody, the consciousness we develop, these create ripples that extend far beyond our individual lives. Consider how a single candle can light 1,000 others without diminishing its own flame. This is the nature of authentic knowledge. Unlike material possessions that divide when shared, wisdom multiplies. But most people live as if their insights will die with them, never realizing they carry the power to illuminate countless other lives. In 1977, psychologist Erik Erikson identified what he called generativity, the deep human need to nurture and guide the next generation. His research showed that people who fail to achieve this developmental stage experience profound stagnation and despair in later life. They realize too late that a life lived only for oneself is ultimately meaningless. Jung observed something similar in his patients. Those who approached death with the greatest peace were not necessarily the wealthiest or most accomplished, but those who had successfully transmitted their hard-won understanding to others. They had transformed their personal suffering into collective wisdom. The Stoics understood this intuitively. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not for publication, but as personal reminders. Yet these private reflections have guided millions across 20 centuries. He achieved a form of immortality not through monuments or titles, but through the quality of thought he left behind. But here's the paradox Jung discovered. The more consciously you try to create a legacy, the more artificial it becomes. True influence emerges naturally from authentic living. When you genuinely embody what you've learned, when you integrate wisdom into your daily existence, others naturally absorb it through proximity. This is why the deepest teaching happens not through formal instruction, but through example. A parent who faces adversity with grace teaches more about resilience than any lecture could convey. A person who continues growing despite setbacks demonstrates possibilities that words alone cannot capture. The question then becomes not what you will leave behind, but who you will become in the process of becoming it. Because the legacy worth leaving is not found in what you accumulate, but in who you help others discover themselves to be. Your consciousness, refined through years of deliberate growth, becomes a gift to the collective human experience. In this way, individual development serves something greater than personal ambition. So ask yourself, are you becoming someone worth emulating? Because that person, that integrated self, that wisdom bearer, is your true immortality.